Welcome to Darkened Dreams. As we dive into tonight's unsettling tale, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I've always had a soft spot for vintage electronics. There's something about the way they look and feel that modern gadgets just can't replicate. So when I saw an old wooden radio listed on Craigslist, I knew I had to have it. The seller described it as a vintage piece from the 1940s, still in working condition, and the price was surprisingly low. The ad had only been up for a few hours, and I was quick to contact the seller. He responded almost immediately, saying he was eager to get rid of it. He mentioned that it had been in his family for decades, passed down from his grandfather, but he had no room for it anymore. That should have been a red flag, but I was too excited to care. The seller's house was in an older part of town, filled with narrow streets and old leaning buildings. As I pulled up, I noticed the sky was darkening, and a light drizzle began to fall, making the already gloomy neighborhood feel even more eerie. The house itself was run down, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. It looked like it hadn't seen care in years. The man who greeted me was in his late 30s, with a weary expression and eyes that seemed haunted. He didn't say much as he led me inside. The house was filled with old furniture and knickknacks, the kind of place that felt more like a museum than a home. The radio sat on a dusty shelf in the living room, just as he had described it, wooden, with large knobs and a glass dial that had yellowed with age. As soon as I saw it, I knew I had to have it. The seller didn't even haggle over the price. He seemed relieved to be rid of it. I handed over the cash, and with his help, we loaded the heavy radio into the back of my car. He didn't say much as I drove away, just watched me with that same weary, haunted look. When I got home, the rain had picked up, turning into a steady downpour. I wrestled the radio inside, placing it in the corner of my living room. It fit perfectly with the rest of my vintage collection, and I couldn't wait to try it out. I plugged it in, expecting the usual crackle of static before it found a station. But as soon as I turned the dial, the radio came to life with a clear, strong signal. At first, it played an old jazz tune, the kind you'd expect from a radio this old. But then the music cut out abruptly, replaced by a low, droning hum. I tried turning the dial, but it wouldn't budge. The hum grew louder, filling the room with a vibrating, almost suffocating sound. Suddenly, voices began to emerge from the static, whispers, barely audible at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. Help, trapped, can't escape. I froze, my hand still on the dial. The voices were frantic, desperate, like someone was pleading for their life. I pulled my hand back, but the radio continued on its own, the dial turning slowly, as if someone else was controlling it. The voices grew louder, more frantic. Please, you have to help us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I yanked the plug from the wall, but the radio didn't stop. It kept playing, the voices now a cacophony of screams and sobs. The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick and heavy. I stumbled back, tripping over a chair as I tried to get away from the radio, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. The radio sat in the corner, dark and still, as if nothing had happened. I stared at it, my heart racing, unsure of what I had just experienced. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those voices, pleading, crying, begging for help. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with that radio. The next day, I decided to get rid of it. I couldn't have it in my house anymore, but when I went to move it, the radio wouldn't budge. It was as if it had rooted itself to the floor. No matter how hard I pulled or pushed, it wouldn't move. Desperate, I grabbed a hammer and tried to smash it, but the wood was unnaturally strong. The hammer bounced off with a dull thud. As the days went by, the radio became more active. It would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, playing those same desperate voices. The hum would return, vibrating through the walls, filling my house with that suffocating sound. I could hear them even when I was outside, their cries echoing in my ears. I tried to contact the seller, but his number was disconnected, and the ad had been taken down. It was as if he had vanished. I even went back to the house, but it was empty, abandoned, with no sign of anyone having lived there for years. Now I'm stuck with this cursed radio. I can't get rid of it, can't destroy it. The voices won't leave me alone, and I can feel them getting closer, as if they're trying to reach me through the static. I don't know how much longer I can take it. The radio is on as I write this, the hum louder than ever. I don't know what to do. If you ever see a vintage radio on Craigslist, avoid it at all costs. It's not worth the nightmare that comes with it. I wish I had known that before I brought this thing into my home. I've always been a sucker for a good deal, so when I saw an ad on Craigslist for a high-end laptop at a fraction of the price, I couldn't resist. The seller claimed it was in perfect condition, barely used, and needed to get rid of it quickly due to moving out of state. It sounded like the perfect opportunity. The day of the meeting was typical for late autumn: grey skies, a cold wind that cut through my jacket, and a light drizzle that made everything damp and miserable. I arrived at the coffee shop early, sipping on a hot drink to warm my chilled hands while waiting for the seller to arrive. The shop was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of quiet conversations. It was the kind of place where nothing bad seemed like it could ever happen. When he walked in, I recognized him immediately. Mid-30s, a bit scruffy but friendly enough. He shook the rain off his jacket and pulled the laptop out of a worn backpack, placing it on the table between us. The device looked pristine, just as he'd described. He booted it up to show me that it worked fine, and everything seemed legit. I handed over the cash, and he was out the door before I even packed up the laptop. The rain had picked up by the time I left the coffee shop. The wind whipped it into sheets that slanted across the street, making visibility poor as I hurried home. The laptop tucked securely under my arm. The weather was miserable, but I was satisfied with my purchase until things started to get weird. I was drying off at home when the first notification popped up on the laptop screen. It wasn't connected to Wi-Fi, yet there it was. A message in a chat window I hadn't opened. The text read, "You shouldn't have bought this." I felt a chill run down my spine, colder than the dampness clinging to my clothes. I tried to close the window, but it wouldn't go away. The cursor wouldn't even move. The screen flickered, and then another message appeared. "It's too late now." I slammed the laptop shut and stood there, staring at it, my heart racing. Outside, the rain pounded against the windows, the wind howling like some lost, vengeful spirit. By the time I got home, I was trying to convince myself that it was just a prank, some kind of weird virus. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. That night, I decided to wipe the laptop clean and reinstall the operating system. As soon as I powered it on, though, the same chat window popped up. This time, the message was different. "I'm in your house." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The wind rattled the windows, and the rain lashed at the glass as if trying to force its way inside. I glanced around my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing there, but everything was silent except for the storm. I shut the laptop again and sat there trying to think rationally. Maybe it was a sick joke, maybe the guy had hacked the laptop somehow, but how would he know where I lived? Then I heard a noise, a faint creaking sound like a door slowly opening. I lived alone, and I hadn't opened any doors. My heart pounded as I grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and moved cautiously toward the sound. As I approached the bedroom, the door was ajar, even though I always kept it closed. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, a musty scent that hadn't been there before. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting someone to jump out at me. The room was empty, but there was something on the bed, the laptop. I hadn't brought it into the bedroom, yet there it was, sitting perfectly in the center of the bed, screen glowing. The chat window was open again, with a single message. "You can't escape." I didn't think twice. I grabbed the laptop, rushed to the living room, and smashed it against the floor until the screen shattered and the keys flew off. But even as it lay there in pieces, I could still see those words burned into my mind. I spent the rest of the night at a friend's place, too shaken to be alone. The storm raged outside, the wind howling and the rain hammering down as if the world itself was furious. The next day I went back to the coffee shop where I'd met the seller, hoping to find him, to demand answers. But when I asked the barista about him, she said no one like that had been there. In fact, she hadn't even seen me talking to anyone that night. I've since moved to a new apartment, far from where it all happened, but every now and then, when the wind howls and the rain pounds against the windows, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched, like the laptop's curse didn't die when I smashed it, and every so often, in the dead of night, I hear the faint sound of keys clicking, like someone typing a message that I never want to see. I've always been a fan of old furniture. There's just something about the history and craftsmanship that draws me in. So when I found a solid wood bookshelf on Craigslist for next to nothing, I couldn't pass it up. The seller's photos showed an ornate, dark wood piece aged beautifully with intricate carvings. It was exactly what I'd been looking for to complete my living room. The ad had been up for a while, which surprised me, given how impressive the bookshelf looked. The seller, someone named Evan, didn't seem too concerned about the price. He was more focused on getting rid of it quickly, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too excited about the find to care. The drive to the seller's house took longer than expected. He lived in a rural area far from the city's reach, where the roads were narrow and the trees seemed to close in on you. The sky was overcast. The kind of dull grey that makes everything seem heavier. It started drizzling as I pulled up to the address Evan had provided. The house was old and isolated, with peeling paint and a porch that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Evan greeted me at the door, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a forced smile. He was polite enough, though he didn't offer much small talk. I followed him inside, where the air was thick with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't quite place, something musty and stale. The house was cluttered with old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. It felt like walking into a forgotten time. The bookshelf stood in the living room, exactly as it had appeared in the photos, except somehow darker, almost foreboding. The wood was almost black, the carvings more pronounced, as if the details had deepened over time. Evan seemed eager to get rid of it, offering to help load it into my truck without much fuss. I handed him the cash, and within minutes I was on my way back home, the bookshelf secured in the back. By the time I got home, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain. I wrestled the bookshelf inside on my own, getting soaked in the process. Once it was in place, I stood back to admire it, but something felt off. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if the bookshelf was absorbing the warmth. The carvings, which I had initially admired, now seemed twisted, almost grotesque. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like the creaking of wood. I brushed it off as the house settling, but then it came again, closer this time. I got out of bed and walked into the living room. The bookshelf stood in the corner, looming over everything else. The rain battered against the windows, and for a moment, I thought I saw the shadows around the bookshelf moving, shifting like something was inside it. I chalked it up to my imagination and went back to bed, but the noise didn't stop. It continued every night, always at the same time, just after midnight. It wasn't just creaking anymore. There were whispers, barely audible, like someone speaking from far away. I could never make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. One night, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the bookshelf. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing. The carvings seemed to pulse, the dark wood almost alive under my touch. And then, as I stood there, I heard a low, guttural voice, deep and raspy, coming from within the bookshelf. "Help me!" I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself. The voice was clear, desperate. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the house, not with whatever was happening. I grabbed my keys and fled, driving aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets until I found myself at a motel on the edge of town. I checked in, trembling, and spent the night trying to make sense of what had happened. The next morning, I returned to the house. determined to get rid of the bookshelf. But when I opened the door, the smell hit me, stronger than before, like something rotting. I gagged as I stepped inside, and that's when I saw it. The bookshelf had changed. It was no longer the dark, aged wood I had brought home. It was now covered in mold, the carvings obscured by a thick layer of decay. And in front of it, lying on the floor, was a small, weathered box. I don't know how it got there, but I knew it had something to do with the voice. My hands shook as I picked it up, the wood damp and slimy to the touch. Inside was a piece of parchment, old and brittle, with writing I couldn't decipher. But there was one thing I could understand, the name at the bottom. Evan. I threw the box and parchment into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. But I knew it wasn't over. The whispers, the voice, the creaking, they're still there, growing louder each night. I can't stay in the house anymore. The bookshelf isn't just a piece of furniture. It's something else, something that should have stayed forgotten. I've since moved, but even now I can't escape it. The last thing I heard before I left was a whisper clear as day coming from the bookshelf as I closed the door for the last time. Help me.